I am crucified with Christ, and nevertheless I live, yet not I, but Christ lives in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. What a powerful truth. Amen. Thank you. You may be seated. Welcome. It's great to have you worshiping with us. Welcoming those from the chapel up at the Sioux. Those who are church online, we welcome you. Those who are watching on Folks Listen TV, listening on the Eagle 101.5 FM. No matter how you're joining us today, we welcome you. And by the way, if your goal was to wait till the last minute to sign up for one of our M3 groups, congratulations. You've made it, because they start this week. And so today's the last day to sign up for an M3 group. There are like 10 groups being offered at the Gaylor campus, 5 groups up at the Sioux campus. We have online groups that are coming. There's women groups, there's men groups, there's groups for marriage. There's groups just designed to get together and connect over a game night. There's groups that get together to serve, whether it's in our kids ministry or in our community. There are Bible study groups. You name it, it's there. So what you need to do today is go to m3groups.org, sign up for one of those groups. If you want more information about our M3 groups, you can see Pastor Chad out in the foyer. And that's one of the things that we want to encourage every single person to be part of, because we believe that spiritual growth happens in the context of authentic relationships. M3 groups are designed for just that purpose. So please, m3groups.org. And I don't even mind if you use the sermon time to pull it up and sign up right now. That would be okay. m3groups.org. Well, today we're going to continue our journey through the life of Abraham. And our journey today takes us into Genesis chapter 16. Now, as I really poured into this passage this week, a morbid thought crossed my mind. And I almost feel embarrassed that it crossed my mind. How many of you remember the old TV talk show hosted by a guy named Jerry Springer? I know you never watched it, you're good Christians, but how many remember that show, right? And I truly believe that if Jerry Springer would have had his show back in the days of Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar would have been guests on the Jerry Springer show. That's how bizarre chapter 16 in the book of Genesis gets. Now, what's going to happen is this. We're going to see that God has promised Abraham that he would have a son, and that would end up being a great nation. But it's been 10 years since he made that promise. Abraham was 75 when God made that promise to him. He's 85 as Genesis 16 begins. Not only that, not only has he not got any younger, his wife hasn't got any younger. She's 75 at this time. And she's still barren. There still are no kids. It's been 10 years. And Abraham and Sarah are going to make a fatal mistake. Instead of continuing to trust in the promise of God, they're going to take matters into their own hands. They're basically going to look at God and say, I'll do it myself. Now remember, whenever God makes a promise, usually there is a gap between when God makes the promise and when God fulfills the promise. Would you not agree? You look at the Bible, anytime you see God make a promise, the fulfillment usually doesn't come right away. There's a gap of time, and then God fulfills the promise. And what happens during this gap, we have to make a decision. Are we going to keep trusting in the promise of God, or are we going to take matters into our own hands? I'd like to suggest to you this principle, that God does some of his best work in our lives during the gap. In fact, I think we could say this: spiritual growth is in the gap. And so what we're going to see is Abraham and Sarah going away from that. And instead, they're going to say, I'll do it myself. Now, as we look at it, we're going to learn some principles about spiritual failure, because this is going to be one of Abraham's biggest. And so I want to begin with this principle. And the principle is this: spiritual failure occurs when we listen to people instead of listening to God. When we quit listening to God and start listening to other people, that's when spiritual failure occurs in our life. And that's what's going to happen to Abraham. We're going to see that as we begin reading in Acts chapter 16, verse number 1. Now Sarah, Abraham's wife, had borne him no children. She's 75, he's 85. It's been 10 years since God made the promise. And she, Sarah, had an Egyptian maid whose name was Hagar. Someone asked me this week, how do we know that Hagar was an Egyptian? That's how we know right there. They had an Egyptian maid named Hagar. Now, by the way, how did they get Hagar as part of their group? How did Hagar come to be the maid of Sarah? Well, most likely it happened a couple chapters ago when God had called Abraham into the land of Canaan, but things got tough. So Abraham instead took his family down into Egypt. He said, I'll do it myself. He took matters into his own hands. He told Sarah, lie, tell everybody you're my sister, or they'll kill me to have you if they think you're my wife. But Pharaoh wanted her. Thinking she was Abraham's sister, he loaded Abraham down with gold, silver, and Egyptian servants. And then God struck Pharaoh's home with a plague because he had a married woman, though he didn't know she was married. He figures out what's going on and basically says to Abraham, just take everything I've given you and get out of here. Leave Egypt so your God will leave me alone. And Abraham and Sarah leave with the gold, with the silver, and with the Egyptian servants. That's how they got Hagar. Hagar is in the picture to begin with because Abraham earlier had taken matters into his own hands. So Hagar is Sarah's servant. Verse 2 says this: So Sarah said to Abraham, now behold, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. And that was true up to that point. And then she says this. It says, please go into my maid, Hagar. Perhaps I will obtain children through her. So now Sarah, the wife of Abraham, comes up with this idea. She's taking matters into her own hands. She sits down and she says, Abby, honey, this ain't working. And so here's what I think we should do. I think you should take my servant Hagar as a second wife. Sleep with her. Maybe that's how God will fulfill the promise. Now, at this point, what should Abraham have done? Well, he should have taken some leadership, should he not? He should have said to Sarah, sweetheart, I know you're hurting. I know we've been waiting and waiting and waiting and nothing's happening. But sweetheart, we need to keep trusting God. That's what he should have said. In fact, I'll say he should have went a step further and said, and by the way, sweetheart, even if no child comes, you're all I need. Would that not have been a great thing for Abraham to say? Yeah, boy, the wives woke up. But notice what Abraham says, because now all you husbands will wake up. And Abraham listened to the voice of Sarah. Abraham goes, well, baby, if it will make you feel better, I'll take one for the team. That's basically what he says. Yeah, I'm glad you men didn't amen on that one. But that's really what he says right there. I can't believe he listens to the voice of Sarah. You see, ladies and gentlemen, spiritual failure occurs when you quit listening to the voice of God and you start listening to the voice of others. Now, the problem wasn't that Sarah was his wife. Men, please don't take this verse and say, honey, I can never listen to you again. That's not what this verse is teaching. The problem wasn't that Sarah was Abraham's wife. In fact, men, I would say you would do very well to listen a little more to your wives. The problem was that Sarah was giving Abraham counsel that was opposite what God had been saying. And spiritual failure occurs when you start listening to others instead of listening to God. Verse 3. And after Abraham had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Abraham's wife Sarah took Hagar the Egyptian, her maid, and gave her to her husband Abraham as his wife. Now, I'm sure that Abraham and Sarah had more of a conversation than's recorded here in Genesis 16, because they had to do what we've become very good at doing today. They had to justify in their heart and in their mind why this act of a sexual sin was okay. Now, how do we know, first of all, that this was a sexual sin? Well, because back in Genesis chapter 2 and verse number 24, God gives us the purpose of marriage. And notice what he says, Genesis 2:24. For this reason, a man will leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. It wasn't, and the three become one flesh. The two become one flesh. And by the way, the very next verse in Genesis says this, and they were naked and unashamed. Now, what's that tell me? It tells me that God's plan for sexual intimacy is very clear in Genesis 2. By the way, it's repeated by Jesus in Matthew. It's repeated by Paul in Ephesians, so it never changed. And it's this. God created sexual intimacy to be enjoyed between one man with one woman who's married to each other. That's the biblical pattern. One man with one woman married to each other. So then, based on that, what is sexual sin? Well, based on that, sexual sin is this. I don't have to get specific. Sexual sin is any sexual activity that is outside of one man with one woman who's married to each other. That's simple. That's sexual sin. Now, what Sarah and Abraham had to do was to justify in their heart and in their mind why this was okay for them. And I don't know exactly how they did it. We don't see the whole conversation. I guess we could kind of guess a little bit, because maybe it's Sarah saying to Abraham, now, Abe, what exactly did God tell you? Well, if you remember last week, when Abraham said to God, are you going to make Eleazar, my servant, my heir? And God said, that man will not be your heir. You will have an heir from your own body. And maybe Sarah said, well, honey, God said you'll have an heir from your body. He didn't say anything about my body, so this is really okay. I don't know how they did it, but somehow, some way, they had to justify in their heart and in their minds that this sexual sin was okay with God. By the way, in the church today, we have become really good at doing the same thing. We have become really good at justifying why our sexual sin is okay. I hear it all. I hear people say, oh, well, it's okay because God gave me a peace about it. Ladies and gentlemen, God will never give you a peace about participating in sexual sin. He just won't. Well, it's okay because God led that person into my life. And we go out of our way to justify it. Let me say this to you as clearly as I can say it. This story's going to back it up. Folks, listen. No matter how much you think you have justified sexual sin in your heart or in your mind, sexual sin is always outside of God's will for your life. Doesn't matter how much you've justified it. It's always outside of God's will for your life, because God's will is that it's between one man and one woman married to each other. By the way, chances are really good a lot of people were talking to Sarah. Now, why do I say that? Because if you go back and you study the culture of the Chaldean time of that area, you'll discover that culturally, this was a very acceptable thing to do. If you could not give your husband a child, you were expected in the culture of that area, you were expected to give him one of your servants so he could have a child. It was a very culturally acceptable thing to do. And I'm sure that for 10 years, Sarah's had people around her going, Sarah, you know what you should do. Sarah, it's the right thing to do. And I see that happen all the time today. I watch people dive into sexual sin because their friends, even their Christian friends, are telling them it's okay. Because they find a pastor who tells them it's okay. And by the way, you can find a pastor somewhere who will tell you just about anything. Or because they read it in some book written by a Christian author that it's okay. Folks, listen, no matter how acceptable sexual sin is in our culture today, it is always outside of God's will for your life. Always. And that's what we see in this story. So the first principle we learn is this, that spiritual failure occurs when we quit listening to God and we start listening to others. That leads us to the second principle, and it's this. Spiritual failure always produces negative results. Spiritual failure always produces, in time, negative results. Let me read beginning in verse 4. Abraham went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when Hagar saw that she had conceived, her mistress Sarah was despised in her sight. And Sarah said to Abraham, may the wrong done me be upon you. Yeah, I know it was my idea, but it's still your fault, Abraham. Go figure. I gave my maid into your arms. But when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her sight. Now may the Lord judge between you and me. May God show who's really at fault here. Now this is where Abraham has a chance to step up. He has a chance to show leadership. You decide if he does. Verse 6. But Abraham said to Sarah, behold, your maid Hagar is in your power. Do to her what's good in your sight. So Sarah treated her harshly, and Hagar fled from her presence. Let me just real quick show you a laundry list of the negative things that happen because Abraham and Sarah took matters into their own hands. You really can summarize it with this statement. Listen, sexual sin always destroys relationships. Sexual sin always destroys relationships. Look at it. First of all, we find that Hagar despises Sarah. Hagar gets pregnant. Now she despises Sarah. She looks down at Sarah. Now, for a moment, let's kind of try to put ourselves in Hagar's sandals. She's an Egyptian woman who was forced to leave her hometown, her own country, because Pharaoh gave her as a servant to Abraham and Sarah. She has faithfully served them for the last 10 years. But now she's become nothing more than a pawn, nothing more than a piece of property. And Sarah, and I'm sure Hagar, did not have any choice in the matter. Sarah says, Hagar, you're now going to be my husband's second wife. Go get your veil on. That's really what she says. And Hagar now has to get married to and go into the honeymoon tent with this 85-year-old man who does not love her in the least. He's only with her for one reason, to use her body as a baby factory. And it was all Sarah's idea. So now Hagar gets pregnant and she's like, all right, Sarah, guess what? Guess what we just learned? We just learned this. Up until now, we didn't know who had the problem. Was it Abraham that couldn't conceive or you that couldn't conceive? Now we know who the problem is. It's you. You're cursed. I'm blessed. You almost can't get mad at Hagar for feeling that way. But Hagar despises Sarah. What else happens? Sarah blames Abraham. May the wrong done me be upon you. This is all your fault. That's an amazing statement. Amazing. But sexual sin always destroys relationships. And then what happens next? Abraham fails to take responsibility. Abraham looks at Sarah, and by the law, technically, Hagar was Sarah's property, but she was also Abraham's wife. And Abraham just says to Sarah, do what you want with her. How would you like to have been Hagar? You just had to marry this man who just wanted your body as a baby factory. You're now giving him what he wants, and he still has no appreciation for you. He still says, Sarah, just do with her what you want. Sexual sin always destroys relationships. So what happens? Sarah mistreats Hagar. She treated her harshly. We don't know exactly what that means, but it was bad enough that finally Hagar runs away. And we'll learn in a second she's running back home towards Egypt. She's going to run through the wilderness back home. She's pregnant. By herself, she's going to leave and run through the wilderness, go through the wilderness back to Egypt. The chance of her making it on her own through that large wilderness was very slim. But spiritual failure always produces negative results. The New Testament says it this way: God is not mocked. Whatever a man sows, that will he also reap. So here's Hagar running through the wilderness back towards Egypt. And this is where we learn the third principle. Here it is. Running is never the answer to spiritual failure. Running is never the answer to spiritual failure. We see that in the text. Look at verse number 7. Now the angel of the Lord found Hagar by a spring of water in the wilderness, and the spring was on the way to the city of Shur. Shur would have been the border town to Egypt. She was on her way back to Egypt. She is resting at a well. And there the angel of the Lord found her. Now please note this carefully. It doesn't say an angel of the Lord found her, like one of the angels. It was a very specific angel. The angel of the Lord. This is the very first time this individual is mentioned, the angel of the Lord. And there's a lot of speculation over who it was. It's obviously somebody specific. Some say it's Gabriel because he's going to give to Hagar a similar message that Gabriel gave to Mary in the New Testament. However, and I don't have time to give you all the proof, but we'll see some of them as we keep in the story. I believe that the angel of the Lord, as seen in the Old Testament, is a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus himself. Remember, when Jesus was born in Bethlehem, that wasn't his beginning. He has always existed as the second person of the Trinity. And there are times in the Old Testament he makes an appearance. In fact, there will be times that the angel of the Lord appear and people worship the angel of the Lord. Now, we know from the New Testament, whenever somebody tried to worship an angel, what did the angel do? Do not worship me, only worship God. But the angel of the Lord accepts the worship. We'll see here in a moment that Hagar believes she is talking to God. I believe this is the second person of the Trinity. making a pre-incarnate appearance. We would call it in theology a Christophany in the Old Testament. And I love this. Here's Hagar. She's been in the wrong too. She's also been greatly abused. But Jesus goes out and finds her. And he meets her by the well. And ultimately, he's going to use this time to reveal more about God to her. It reminds me of a similar story in the New Testament, when Jesus meets a foreign woman who was very immoral by a well in Samaria and reveals more of himself to her. So notice what happens as I keep reading. The angel of the Lord found her by the spring. In verse 8, he said, Hagar, Sarah's maid, where have you come from? Where are you going? She said, I'm fleeing from the presence of my mistress Sarah. And the angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress. Submit yourself to her. Running is never the answer to spiritual failure. We see that even in the story of the prodigal son. There came a point in his life when he realized he needed to return to his father. So often, when we step into spiritual failure, we tend to run further away from God. We tend to run further away from the church. We tend to run further away from Christian fellowship. We tend to run further away from our Bibles and further away from prayer. And running is never the answer to spiritual failure. Now, look what happens next. Here's the next principle, and this is my favorite one in the story. Even spiritual failure can cause us to see God in a new way. Even spiritual failure can cause us to see God in a new way. Let me read verses 10 through 12. Then I want to make a couple quick points, and then I want to really zero in on a couple names. Here we go. Moreover, the angel of the Lord said to her, I will greatly multiply your descendants. The angel of the Lord did not say, the Lord will. He said, I will. I believe this is Jesus. I will greatly multiply your descendants, so there'll be too many to count. The angel of the Lord said to her further, behold, you're with child. You'll bear a son. You'll call his name Ishmael. Now note that name. We'll talk about it in a moment. There's a reason you're going to call him Ishmael. Here's the reason. Because the Lord has given heed to your affliction. He will be a wild donkey of a man, very independent, free roaming. His hand will be against everyone. Everyone's hand will be against him, and he'll live to the east of all of his brothers. So, notice first of all, the angel of the Lord makes some promises to Hagar. You're going to have descendants. You're going to bear a son. You're going to name that son Ishmael because the Lord has taken heed to your affliction. The name Ishmael literally means God hears. You are to name your son God hears because the Lord has heard your affliction. What is he saying to this lady? He's saying to her, listen, every time in the future you use your son's name, every time you say, Ishmael, time for dinner, Ishmael, time for bed, Ishmael, come here. Every time you call out his name, you are going to be reminded that the true God of this world hears you. Now, why is this amazing to me? Well, Hagar would not have been a worshiper of the God of Israel, the God of the Bible. She's Egyptian. Now, she's lived in Abraham and Sarah's camp for 10 years. She knows about their God. But can I ask you a question? After the way Abraham and Sarah just treated her, as she's sitting by that well, what do you think she thinks about their God? I bet you that Hagar may be like many people today who say, I will not go to church because it's full of what? Hypocrites. And it is. They're seated all around you. By the way, they're seated in your chair. because we all pretend at times. But folks, you don't go to church for the people. You go to church for the Lord. He's not a hypocrite. And I bet you that Hagar is thinking to herself, sitting by that well, what kind of God do they have that they would do this to me? And now God is revealing himself to her. And she's now seeing God in a whole new way. She is now being introduced to the God who hears. But it gets better. He'll make some predictions about Ishmael. He'll be free roaming, independent. He will have all kinds of conflict. And that's true today, 4,000 years later. All the Arab nations are descendants of Ishmael. For 4,000 years, all kinds of Arab-Israeli conflict continues even to this day. But look at verse number 13. Oh, look at this. This is so good. Then Hagar called the name of the Lord who spoke to her. Stop. Who was speaking to her? The angel of the Lord. Who does Hagar say that the angel of the Lord is? The Lord. Then she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her. You are a God who sees. For she said, have I even remained alive after seeing him? She knows this is God talking to her. She's amazed she's even alive. And she calls him, you are a God who sees. Do you realize this is the only time in the Bible someone gives a name to God? She just gave God a nickname. You are a God who sees. She's thinking back over her life. When Pharaoh gave me as property to Abraham to begin with, and I had to leave Egypt, God, you saw that even though I didn't know who you were. Those 10 years I served Sarah as her maid, you saw it even though I didn't know who you were. When Sarah gave me as a piece of property to be a second wife to her husband, you saw even though I didn't know who you were. When I had to go into that honeymoon tent with that 85-year-old man who did not love me at all, you saw, even though I didn't know who you were. When Sarah was mistreating me, you saw, and I didn't know who you were. When I ran into Egypt and sat by this well thinking I was probably going to die, you saw, even though I did not know who you were. But now I know who you are. This is amazing. And it gets even better because look at the name she gives to the spring. Look at it. Verse 14. Therefore, the well was called Bir Lahairoi. What does Bir Lahairoi mean? It's Hebrew for Budweiser. No, it's not. Bir Lahairoi. It literally means this. It is the well of the living one who sees me. She has a whole new view of God. He's not just this God that these hypocrites, Abraham and Sarah, talked about and sacrificed to. He is the living God who sees me. And even spiritual failure can allow you to see God in a whole new way. Because it'll allow you to see his grace. It will allow you to see his forgiveness. It will allow you to see his mercy. And folks, let me just say this to you. Because I'm sure, and I have no one in mind individually, but I'm sure that there are people sitting at all of our campuses, people watching at home right now on TV or internet or listening on the radio in their car. I'm sure there are many of you who have committed sexual sin. And I'm sure that there are many of you who are committing it right now. And here's what I want you to know. God's not done with you. God will meet you at the well. God will reveal himself to you in a whole new way. The answer isn't for you to run away from God. The answer is for you to run toward him. He is the living one who sees. And he'll forgive you. He'll restore you. Spiritual failure can allow you to see God in a whole new way. Then verses 15 and 16, just to wrap up the story. So Hagar bore Abraham a son, and Abraham called the name of his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Now wait. Who did God give the command to name him Ishmael? Hagar. So that tells me that when Hagar went back, like the angel told her to do, she went back a whole different person. She went back as one who now knew who this living God was. She tells Abraham all about it, and Abraham believes her. And Abraham calls him Ishmael. God hears. Now, verse 16 then says this. Abraham was 86 years old when Hagar gave birth to Ishmael. It's now been 11 years since the promise was given that he and Sarah would have a son. But guess what? It's going to be 14 more years before that son will be born. Abraham is still in the gap. And even though Abraham and Sarah and Hagar had made some really bad decisions in the gap because they took matters into their own hands, there was still time for them to realize that God does some of his best work in your heart during the gap. It's the gap that creates growth. And we'll see that in Abraham's life. So let me end with this final principle. I think it's a principle that this story and every single episode of the Jerry Springer Show teaches us. And here's the principle. I've said it to you many times. Spiritual failure should teach us that it's always better in the end if we simply had obeyed God from the beginning. Would you stand with me for prayer? So, Father, I pray right now for many, many, many individuals who I believe your Spirit is working in their heart. Maybe it's due to a spiritual failure in their past. Maybe it's due to a spiritual failure going on in their life right now. Maybe it's just an individual who's in that gap time right now and is struggling to keep trusting the promises of God. I pray, God, that you would use this story and the example of Abraham and Sarah and Hagar and Ishmael to teach us so that we don't make the same mistakes. And for those who have found themselves in spiritual failure, my prayer is that they will no longer run away from you, but rather they'll run to you. And God, help us. Help us to be honest. We're so good at justifying sin, especially sexual sin. And there are voices all around us, some even under the umbrella of Christianity, that tell us it's okay. But help us to always remember that sexual sin is always outside of your will for our lives. It always produces negative results. Help us, Father, to trust you, to obey you, to lean into you when those temptations come. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.